You were never asked to stop thinking. You were only asked to interrupt it often, and that was enough to make you easy to control. The problem is not that your mind is not sharp enough. That is just the comfortable story. The real problem is that your mind has been trained not to stay anywhere long enough to become dangerous. It was fragmented intentionally, not through some dramatic conspiracy, but through an attention economy that works perfectly without ever needing your conscious consent. They didn't ask you to give up thinking. They only asked you to interrupt it often, and that was enough. A constantly interrupted mind does not collapse. It thins out. It becomes shallow without realizing it. It continues to function, to consume, to respond, to speak, but nothing goes all the way through anymore. It no longer completes internal processes. It no longer reaches its own conclusions. It only reacts to conclusions delivered to it. If you look closely, you'll notice that most people are not stupid. They are rushed. And urgency is one of the most effective forms of control because it eliminates deliberation without appearing violent. Whoever rushes you doesn't need to convince you. They only need to stop you from checking. Machiavelli would have recognized this mechanism immediately, not because he spoke about technology, but because he understood the effect. A man who cannot stay with a thought until the end is incapable of holding a position. And whoever cannot hold a position will adopt the positions of others, clearer, firmer, better packaged. Clarity is not an accident. It is the rare result of a mind that does not run from its own processes. You were taught to believe that stimulation is life, that constant movement means progress, that being busy is equivalent to being valuable. In reality, excessive busyness is often a form of avoidance, avoidance of complete thought, avoidance of confronting direction, avoidance of decisions that carry cost. Because real decisions cost. They cost time, they cost energy, they cost renunciation. And in a world that keeps you in a state of permanent micro-urgency, you no longer have the resources for decisions that do not offer immediate reward. This is where the first serious crack appears. If you don't control your attention, you don't control your priorities. If you don't control your priorities, you don't control your life. You may feel free, you may choose between options, but the options are already filtered for a tired mind. A tired mind does not seek truth. It seeks relief. And whoever offers fast relief becomes authority, even if they are wrong. This explains why emotion dominates public discourse, why outrage is more widespread than analysis, why fast reaction is praised and silence is treated with suspicion. Because emotion is fast, clarity is slow, and slow is not profitable in a system that lives off your reaction. When we talk about a sharp mind, we are not talking about raw intelligence. We are talking about the ability to maintain focus long enough for thinking to organize itself, to clean itself, to remove noise without forced intervention. Most people never get here because they can't tolerate the first minutes, the initial discomfort, the restlessness, the impulse to check something, to change the subject, to fill the space. They interpret this restlessness as a sign that something is wrong. It isn't. It's the sign that noise is no longer masking internal chaos. A mind accustomed to constant stimulation panics when the stimulation disappears. Not because it is addicted to content, but because it is addicted to avoidance. This is where the first separation happens. Those who immediately return to noise and those who stay. Those who stay not because they are better, but because they are willing to remain in discomfort long enough to observe what happens. And what happens is not pleasant. Repetitive thoughts appear. Old fears, unexamined desires, needs for validation, comparisons, dissatisfactions, everything that stimulation kept in the background rises to the surface, not to destroy you, but to be seen. This is the stage almost no one explains because it doesn't sell, but without it, there is no real clarity, only temporary optimism. Machiavelli was not interested in psychological comfort. He was interested in functionality. And functionality begins where the mind stops lying to itself. A sharp mind is a mind that sees its own mechanisms. It sees its fears without being led by them. It sees its impulses without automatically following them. It sees its emotions without confusing them for truth. That doesn't make you cold, it makes you slow. And slow means deliberate. In a world that reacts instantly, the deliberate man appears dangerous because he cannot be easily anticipated. He does not immediately align. He does not offer fast feedback. He does not enter the imposed rhythm. And any system based on rapid reaction is destabilized by someone who does not rush. This is where the real consequence of a sharp mind begins. Not performance, not success, but a change in your position relative to others. When you no longer react automatically, people begin to adjust around you. Not consciously, nervously. They talk more, explain more, try to fill the space, because space not occupied by reaction is uncomfortable for those accustomed to dominating through speed. Most social games are rhythm games. Who speaks first? Who answers first? Who yields first? When you step out of this rhythm without ostentation, without aggression, without explanation, the structure changes. This is not a technique, it is an effect. And here appears the first wrong temptation: to deliberately use this state as a control tool, to remain silent strategically, to intentionally create tension, to play with others' reactions. This is a trap, because the moment you start using clarity for validation, you lose it. You return to need. A sharp mind does not seek effect, it produces effect. The difference is subtle, but absolute. When clarity is real, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to be immediately understood. You don't need to win every interaction, because you are no longer regulated from the outside. This is the first major loss for those who live off your reactions. They no longer have anywhere to press. Emotional pressure works only where there is internal urgency. Guilt works only where there is a need for approval. Provocation works only where there is uncontrolled ego. When these things no longer drive behavior, the classic mechanisms fail. Not dramatically, ineffectively. At this point, it becomes obvious that sharpening your mind is not a cosmetic upgrade. It is an exit from a system of external regulation. It is the quiet refusal to continue functioning exclusively on stimulus and response. And here, the real question appears, the one most people never ask themselves. If you no longer react automatically, what do you do with the remaining space? Because space is dangerous for those without internal direction. Without reaction, choice remains, and choice requires responsibility. When the mind is no longer constantly pulled from the outside, calm does not appear. A void appears. And the void is not a spiritual state. It is an unoccupied space, and unoccupied spaces demand structure. If you don't have it, the mind tries to improvise it quickly. That is why for many the first moments without stimulation are confusing. Not because they are weak, but because they have never been required to decide without pressure. External pressure is a substitute for internal direction. When it disappears, the question most people avoid their entire lives remains: what do I choose when nothing is pushing me? This is where the difference between a busy mind and a sharp one becomes visible. The busy mind immediately looks for a new stimulus, a new task, a new problem. Anything, as long as it doesn't remain in that neutral space. The sharp mind stays, not out of courage, out of discipline, because it understands that space is the only place where real choice appears. Choice without pressure is rare. Most decisions are well-disguised reactions, reactions to fear, to desire, to comparison, to urgency, to shame. When these engines are reduced, the decision no longer has emotional fuel. And that is frightening. Because without emotion, there is no clear impulse. Neutrality does not tell you what to do, it only shows you what is. At this point, many turn back, not because the path was wrong, but because they cannot tolerate the absence of narrative. Emotion offers story. Story offers meaning. When emotion retreats, the story collapses, and without story, responsibility remains. The responsibility to choose without excuses. A sharp mind begins to notice how much of its life was organized around avoiding this moment. Relationships entered hastily. Projects started without clarity. Conflicts unnecessarily maintained. All served the same role. They filled space. They produced movement. They avoided confrontation with direction. When space remains empty long enough, something new begins to take shape. Not motivation, not ambition, but criterion. Criterion is what remains after noise falls away. It is the ability to say this matters without needing validation, to say this doesn't without elaborate explanations. Criterion is not moral, it is functional. Machiavelli would have recognized this process immediately, not as personal development, but as strategic maturation. A man without criterion can be convinced of anything. A man with criterion can be influenced only if it serves his interest. At this point, your relationship with emotion changes permanently. Emotion does not disappear, but it loses its command position. It becomes information. It appears, it is observed, it is allowed to pass, it no longer demands immediate action. This delay is essential because most manipulation works by reducing the time between stimulus and reaction. They rush you, pressure you, put you in situations where you must respond now. When you no longer respond automatically, the mechanism stalls, not because you are smarter, but because you are no longer fast. Speed is overrated. In thinking, speed is often a sign of shallowness. Precision requires time. Deliberation requires pause. And pause, in a world that runs on instant reaction, is perceived as resistance. That is why, as your mind becomes more stable, you will notice a subtle change around you. People become more attentive, more calculated, sometimes more uneasy. Not because you are doing something active, but because you are no longer doing what you did before. You no longer fill the space. You no longer explain reflexively. You no longer react to every tension. And the absence of these behaviors creates a new friction. Not in you, in others. Because most interactions are based on reciprocal emotional regulation. Someone brings tension. The other absorbs or amplifies it. The rhythm is established quickly. When you no longer enter this exchange, the dynamic destabilizes. This is a form of power few understand because it does not resemble classic power. It does not impose. It does not dominate. It does not demand. It simply does not yield reflexively. Important to understand, this non-reaction is not a game. If it is performed, it is felt, and then it becomes vulnerable. Real non-reaction comes from absence of need, not from strategy. As this state stabilizes, an inevitable side effect appears: selection. Some relationships thin out, others become clearer, a few deepen, not because you decided anything explicitly, but because the old dynamic no longer works. Those who relied on your reactions to feel stable will try to recover them. They will provoke, test, create artificial tensions, not out of malice, out of instinct. Systems always try to return to equilibrium. If you react, equilibrium returns to the old form. If you don't, a new configuration forms. This is where most people fail, because they confuse firmness with rigidity. Rigidity is a form of inverted emotional control. It is felt, it creates resistance, and it can be exploited. Real firmness is flexible. It does not oppose, it does not justify, it does not over-explain. It simply does not move without reason. This quality is extremely rare because it demands something not socially taught: comfort with lack of reaction. Society trains you to respond, to be engaged, to have an opinion, to react quickly, to show that you care. But caring does not mean reacting to everything. Often, reaction is just a form of discharge. A sharp mind does not need constant discharge. It has the capacity to contain. This capacity completely changes your relationship with power, because power no longer comes from directly influencing others, but from reducing your own maneuverability. You become harder to move, harder to rush, harder to push into decisions that are not yours. A heavy object does not actively resist. It simply requires disproportionate effort to be moved. And systems avoid unnecessary effort. At this point, you are no longer an attractive target for others' games, not because you are above, but because the return is low. This is one of the least discussed forms of power, power through strategic unattractiveness. You are not interesting to manipulate because you do not react according to the expected script. As this position becomes natural, you begin to see clearly how much human behavior is driven by fear of losing access. Access to people, access to groups, access to status, access to attention. When you no longer fight for access, you can no longer be controlled through its withdrawal. This is one of the oldest forms of social coercion: exclusion, marginalization, hostile silence. For someone emotionally dependent, these are major threats. For someone internally stable, they are costs. They may be unpleasant, but they are not destabilizing. And here a subtle risk appears. As you observe these dynamics, the temptation arises to identify with the position, to see yourself as above the game. This is a fine error, because it turns clarity into identity, and identity creates need again. The need to be different, the need to be untouchable, the need to be perceived as lucid. This is a more refined form of dependency, and just as vulnerable. Real clarity does not need confirmation. It does not seek mirroring. It does not demand recognition. It functions even when invisible. Here, the transition to the final stage occurs. Not your relationship with others, but your relationship with yourself when external pressure no longer exists. Because then the final question appears, the one few are willing to carry to the end. What do you do when nothing is pulling you? There is a moment, after noise falls away and reactions fade, when nothing remains to be corrected. no tension to resolve, no urgency to manage, no emotion demanding movement. For most people, this moment is unbearable because it reveals something avoided for an entire lifetime: the absence of a stable internal center. When nothing pulls you anymore, you can no longer blame anything. Not context, not others, not pressure. You remain alone with your choices, not the ones made in haste, but the ones that must be made without push. Here it becomes clear whether your mind is truly sharp or merely well-trained in temporary restraint. Because restraint can be maintained for a while, clarity cannot. Clarity requires structure. Most people live off successive impulses. One impulse replaces another. One desire covers a fear. One urgency masks lack of direction. When these layers are removed, a different silence appears. Not comforting, functional. A silence that promises nothing. At this point, the final temptation appears to reintroduce noise, not for pleasure, but for meaning. To create an artificial purpose, to throw yourself into a cause, to define yourself through a role, to give yourself a label to replace real direction. Many confuse this move with maturity. It is not. It is a new avoidance, more refined. Real maturity appears when you can remain in the absence of meaning long enough for criterion to form on its own. Not from emotion, not from comparison, but from repeated observation. Criterion is not a list of values. It is the ability to distinguish what deserves energy and what does not, without moral justification. It is the threshold below which you do not descend and above which you do not rush. It is the cut that remains after noise disappears. Here, the illusion of motivation finally ends. Motivation is for fragile beginnings. A sharp mind does not run on enthusiasm. It runs on rhythm. A chosen rhythm, not an imposed one. Rhythm is the true form of control. Whoever controls your rhythm controls your life. Whoever breaks your rhythm makes you reactive. Whoever rushes you steals your precision. That is why people who live off pressure will always try to transfer it to you, to make you respond, to pull you into their urgency, to drag you into their dynamic. When your mind is sharp, you don't enter, not out of arrogance, out of economy, because you understand that every non-essential entry dilutes your force. At this point, it becomes evident how much of social life is built on reciprocal noise. People speak not to say something, but to reduce internal tension. They react not because it is necessary, but because silence confronts them with themselves. When you no longer participate in this exchange, the dynamic changes without you doing anything. Some will interpret this as coldness, others as depth, others as danger. Interpretation does not matter. Reaction does, and reaction is always adjustment. Over time, you notice that you no longer need to impose boundaries. They appear implicitly. Not because you became rigid, but because you no longer offer space for their violation. You do not respond to unnecessary provocations. You do not over-explain. You do not defend preemptively. These things are disorienting for those accustomed to reaction. Disorientation is a form of break. Here, the clear difference emerges between someone who knows and someone who is. Knowledge can be exposed, contested, attacked. State cannot. State is felt, and people react to it before they can formulate it. Machiavelli would have called this authority without proclamation, power that does not justify itself, influence that does not ask, presence that does not explain. At this point, an inner calm appears that is not comfortable, but stable. Your old reactions begin to seem primitive, not wrong, primitive. Like reflexes once useful, now obsolete. You no longer follow them. You no longer judge them, they simply no longer move you. This is the maturity of a sharp mind. You do not become better. You become more exact, less impressionable, less rushed, less maneuverable. And that changes everything. Because in a world that runs on impulse, the man who is not impulsive appears unpredictable. And unpredictability, when calm, creates distance. Distance creates respect, not because you want it, but because you are no longer accessible through the usual mechanisms. It is important to understand this. This position does not make you superior, it makes you difficult to control. And in a system based on rapid reaction, that is enough. Here, the final illusion ends as well. That power comes from confrontation. It does not. It comes from emotional withdrawal from games that do not deserve your energy, from the ability to recognize distraction even when it is packaged as opportunity. A sharp mind does not rush to accept, nor to reject. It observes, measures, waits, and decides rarely. Rare decisions are the ones that change direction. The rest is noise. If you reach this point without feeling the need to jump, check, defend yourself, or distract yourself, notice what has already happened. You entered a rhythm, not my rhythm, a slower rhythm than the one you are used to. That is the real training, not ideas, not concepts, the ability to remain. If you want to continue this kind of deliberate pressure, do it simply and without ceremony. Give this video a like and subscribe, not as a social gesture, as a decision of selection. In a world that demands your attention, you mark what deserves access. That's all. I don't promise fast results, nor spectacular transformations. I promise something rarer. Clarity that does not seek validation, a mind that no longer lives on reaction, a presence that is no longer easy to move. At the end, inspiration does not remain, weight does. An internal weight that prevents emotion from dominating, noise from leading, and urgency from feeling trustworthy. What remains is the ability to choose without pressure, to remain silent without fear, to act without haste. That is the consequence taken all the way to the end, not a brighter mind, a more exact mind, and exactness does not need to be announced. True transformation begins when thinking stops reacting and starts remaining, when emotion no longer pushes decisions, when calm becomes a constant weight, not a temporary state. At that point, the mind is no longer drawn to chaos, it sees it, and precisely because of that, it is not moved by it. Those who reach this point do not seek confirmation, their presence is enough, not because they dominate, but because they are no longer pulled. If this rhythm felt familiar, mark it. Give this video a like, not as an emotional reaction, but as an act of selection. In a space saturated with noise, deciding what deserves attention is already a form of control.